Very well. Can you hear me okay? B-Man 21? All right, coming through good. Great. Well, thank you so much for taking this debate. Thanks to callout.com and to Yaz and Chelsea and all the folks at Callout for setting up this debate tournament. The debate tonight is about, if you've looked, it's about more guns would make people safer in an active shooter situation. What does that mean when you kind of break it down? What that means is we've seen that a lot of shootings, a lot of mass shootings have occurred in places where the law prohibits people from individual carrying, concealed carrying. So these are, in other words, these are gun-free zones. And let me read this just to sort of start off my point. This is from Truth in Media, albeit a right-leaning media source. So I will be fully disclose that. But because one of the big arguments is that, especially a source called Media Matters for America, they say that the overwhelming majority of mass shootings occur where guns are actually allowed to be carried. But here's the response to this here. It says, so where are the numbers to back that up? So in other words, where are the numbers to back up that most mass shootings occur where people are allowed to carry guns? It comes from a report by a group called Everytown for Gun Safety. Now, that report was published last year, so in this case 2014, and states that only 14% of mass public shootings take place in gun-free zones. Everytown claims that 86% of such incidents occurred in places where guns were allowed. The only problem with that analysis is that according to the Crime Prevention Research Center, the Everytown analysis is wrong. Actually, very wrong. Everytown's recent analysis of mass shootings is riddled with errors. Mistakes are made on the number of mass shootings as well as the extent of mental illness, the killer's ages, and even where the attacks occurred. So what are the correct numbers? In order to get them, the Crime Prevention Research Center looked at mass public shootings since the beginning of 2009. They focused on attacks that have particularly terrified Americans, the mass shootings in public places, basically. So these are shootings about which they say, quote, the point of such crimes is to kill people and creating as much carnage as possible to obtain media attention, end quote. Also, they focused exclusively on shootings, excluding attacks like the Boston Marathon bombing. And they also exclude gang violence and turf wars, which if we were talking about that would be, we might even get into that later, places like Chicago. Again, they're focusing on mass shootings here that are designed to create terror. So what did they find? In from January 2009 through the middle of July 2014, there were 25 mass public shootings where at least 4 people were killed with a gun. So in these 25, at least 4 people were killed. Of those, 8% of mass public shootings occurred in places where civilians are allowed to defend themselves. The other 92% happened in a so-called gun-free zone. So that's the reality of the 25 mass public shootings between the beginning of 2009 and the middle of 2014, where at least 4 people were killed with a gun, which is really what you would define. That's kind of where the mass shooting number begins, is that, 4 or 5 and up. 92% of them were in gun-free zones. Now,
all right, thank you, Eli. So your idea is during an active shooter situation, when it's taking place, if there's people are armed, there's a chance to protect them. But the problem with that situation is, well, one, when active shooter situation takes place, you can't really prepare in your head. It's like it's automatic, on the spot. You don't know what you're going to happen, and it brings down to this problem of, if there are guns, we should use guns to stop the guns. But that situation really suggests that stopping the shooting at the moment is a problem, which it is. But we need to think beyond that, or before that. I mean, let's put it this way. If you were trying to set up a table and it was basically all wobbly and collapsing, would you try to add more legs to the tables for the chance that they would all bounce each other out? Or would you try to brace the table together so that... Can you hear me? All right. Would you try to brace the table together so that they all fit? And the thing is, we always seem to focus on, okay, if there's someone shooting, we should use the guns to stop them. But why should we focus on that when we should focus on stopping the problem before it even begins. We should figure out. Sorry. I'm not getting to the idea of people being limited shooters, but we should put it in the hands of people who are more capable and trusted that. Like, let's say a school does it. Maybe we had like officers who sort of worked in the building and sort of were trusted by the faculty to defend people in case of that. But just saying everyone there should have a gun with them at the moment, it doesn't leave much of a safe space mentality. They say that you're doing this just to keep people safe, to protect them from the possibility of a threat. But we should be able to stop the threat before it begins. We should make sure that this environment can't even take place. And if you tell people that you're basically creating a place to stop the environment, should it occur, you're basically making them more afraid of something that might happen rather than stopping the problem before it can happen. I don't know how you feel about that, but I'll let you take over.
Okay, thank you. I agree with you in the sense that we need to focus on mental health. There needs to be an emphasis there, and a lot of Second Amendment supporters believe that. But what you said about peeling this back, we live in a country with over 300 million people. All of a sudden, something that is a 1 in a million chance of happening gets multiplied by 300. You're going to have violence. You're going to have shooters. You can't avoid these types of violent acts. But what you can avoid is how far they go. The recent shooting attack here in Columbus, Ohio, which is where I live, at my alma mater, Ohio State, a gentleman didn't have a gun, but he drove through a crowd of people with his automobile and then had a knife. The campus police arrived with a gun about 60 seconds after this happened and was able to eliminate the threat with the gun. As this threat was still trying to find people to injure, and the gun stopped the threat. There are numerous accounts that truthfully the mainstream media ignores, where there are people who had a gun who stopped, there are dozens of these a year that just go unreported because it doesn't fit a liberal narrative that these guns do stop the threat from happening immediately. We could talk about the constitutional right to keep and bear arms. Typically that discussion tends to spiral, and it's just a semantics discussion, where you might have a valid point according to one definition of something, and I might have another definition of the same word. So I'd rather not get into the Second Amendment, other than it's in the Bill of Rights, and that we do have it shall not be infringed. But you say that having guns on campus, so to speak, would create some kind of stress or anxiety of something that could happen. But there's no merit to that, because there are lots of places outside of campus that are not gun-free zones, but people don't express this fear of guns when they're in, say, a restaurant that is not a gun-free restaurant, or if they're in public or in a park, or if they're hiking. All of these places, people are allowed to carry guns in a concealed carry, and in some states, even an open carry format. But they don't express the anxiety. I mean, otherwise they'd be living in a world of fear all the time, when they really don't have to. The stats back up that there's no reason for people to fear gun owners, responsible gun owners. And the vast overwhelming majority of people who own guns, especially of people who conceal carry, over 99% of them never have well over 99% never have an incident in their life where they have to pull out that gun. They just have it in a case of a mass shooting, or to defend themselves or to defend somebody else. A lot of people cite the UK's gun laws as being a good standard. That you hear the same thing about Australia, but Australia's model was duplicated, or was designed after the British model, but it hasn't stopped violence. Yeah, we can talk about mental illness, and we should. That should be addressed. and that should definitely be addressed before taking rights away from people who have done nothing wrong, or at least threatening those rights, certainly. But violence, gun-free zones don't stop violence. They don't. And out of 100,000 people in the UK, basically there's 2,034 violent crimes per 100,000 people in the UK. Some are guns, but most are not, because guns just by and large kind of don't exist in the culture there. In America, there's only 466 violent crimes per 100,000 people. I just shared this awesome infographic on my Twitter. You can follow me if you want at Eli Bowman for anyone watching, and you can look at the infographic there yourself. So violent crimes are, getting rid of guns doesn't reduce violent crime. There's a huge variance there with knife attacks, with blunt object attacks, other various violent attacks that don't have guns. But these are kind of one and the same. Now, guns are very violent. Yes, they are, but they also eliminate threats. So I don't want to, I want to make sure that the picture is painted that all because you get rid of guns doesn't mean you get.
All right, thank you. And I understand what you're saying, that just because you have a gun doesn't mean you're going to turn into some crazed armed megalomaniac who will go about shooting people. But we also understand in this country, there are other circumstances, internal and external, that lead into why people choose to do the things they do involving hurting others. Like you mentioned Ohio State. The person who committed these things, his name, Abdul Razak Ali Artan, a lot of what he was going through was the fear of what was happening to him, people like him with Muslim faith, because after the turn of the election, like Trump had raised a lot of things that are hostile against Muslim people and Islam in general. Our country still deals with this fact that we need to blame everyone who practices Islam for everything that ISIS does. Every time an event like this happens, ISIS always takes credit for it, which in turn reinforces this idea that all of them are evil when it's not. But we ourselves are part of the problem in that we pass on the situation, we pass on this mentality that these people are unsafe or they are unwelcome, which in turn causes them to panic. And I get what you're saying, if people have guns, like prevent it. But if we just say, like, okay, you have a gun, you can stop the violence, but what causes the violence in the first place? What is the reason behind why these people act the way they do? It's like illness. Are they feeling hurt? Are they feeling abandoned or afraid? And they do use violence as a means to get people to notice them. That is how they see one another. It's like a child lashing out in anger because no one understands them. The problem is we focus on the wrong aspect. We focus on does bring the gun to stop the gun, solve the problem. And it can, but it leads us blind to the notion that just shooting someone to stop violence will solve that problem, but we'll ignore the fact that someone brought the gun for reasons that we are unaware of, or that the media will distort into some fantastical story of terrorism or mental illness or just something. And it is biased on who gets attacked, because this year alone, there are a ton of shooters, over at least 100. Majority of them were Caucasian American citizens, and they are sort of round them out, causing like mental illness, lone wolf. But in the few cases where it was someone of like Islamic faith, like Abdul, they paint it as a giant picture of terrorism, what we should do against this threat, and all Americans are being under attack. And that sort of, it rejects the problem entirely of that, what can we do to stop this before it takes place, versus let's find someone to blame for it. We blame, say, guns don't kill people, people kill people. But that's a mixture of two things. One, they use the gun to kill people, so we need to limit who is responsible enough to hold a firearm. People who hold a gun, have one on them, can carry them, is part of Second Amendment rights, but they need to check, make sure these people are qualified, responsible, and understand that holding a gun isn't just, it is a right, but it's not just not an entitlement. It's something you need to prove that you know what to do with it. It's like owning a car. Just because you turn a certain age doesn't mean you're automatically going to get a car of your family. You need to prove you're going to drive with respect for the law. Same thing with firearms. We can have them, give people hold on to them in case of emergencies, we also need to make sure that people who use guns know that what they're holding is a dangerous tool that can kill others. And that's why we need sort of background checks and registrations to make sure that who is holding a firearm will prove that they know how to hold a gun. So more guns won't necessarily make things better because you don't know who is using the gun or what the circumstances leading up to those person using a gun in the first place will be. We need to fix those issues as well as make sure people are safe, but we can't just say that, oh, if we bring more guns to stop this gun, the problem is solved.
But more guns, we're talking about active shooter situations here. We're talking specifically. I mean, I understand what you're saying. What you're saying is a broad conversation about gun control in general. There's value in that discussion. Even someone like me who supports the Second Amendment I'm willing to always talk about safety, always talk about mental health, always talk about, how do we keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't. I think the number of people who shouldn't is very small. I think when the government has the ability to put you on an arbitrary list, I think that's dangerous when you're talking about innocent people who accidentally get on a list. Now their rights are gone, their inalienable rights to defend themselves. But we got to bring it back to active shooter situations and into these gun-free zones. Just the let me see. Let me find my I had a really cool stat here. Regarding the guns. So these incidents are violent. These are violent incidents where we see violence coming out and people don't have the ability to stop it with the force of a firearm. There are nine countries in Europe that have the tightest gun control laws, that are the most anti-gun ownership. They have a substantially higher murder rate than actually 3 times that of the 9 European countries that have the highest gun ownership rate. So we see actually less murder in those 9 countries where people have more guns than the other 9 countries where guns are more strict. I know that I mentioned Chicago, but since the conversation's kind of getting broader, let's talk about that. Extremely tight, some of the tightest gun laws in the country. Everyone knows, it's unarguable that the gun violence there is absurd. People have guns that have a history of violence that probably shouldn't own guns. So we know that just the gun laws don't make a difference. The highest ownership rate per 100 residents, so globally speaking, America has the highest gun ownership rate per 100 residents. It's by far 88.8 out of 100 residents in America have a gun. Now, this kind of takes basically into account all the guns that exist in America. So when you count that, it's all the guns that exist is actually far more than the population, but 88.8 out of 100 actually own guns. Second is Yemen at 54.8 out of 100. But that does not equate to intentional homicide, basically homicide rate per 100,000 people. So gun ownership rate is the highest in the world in America per 100,000 people, but the homicide rate per 100,000 people, America is 103rd in the world. You have mentioned more guns, guns stopping guns. Yeah, guns can stop guns. We actually see it. Why are the police armed? The police are armed because they know those firearms can eliminate threats. It's sad that in these military, Fort Hood and in the Marine Recruitment Center, these are soldiers, gun-free zones. These places, gun-free. And look what happens. We do know that 92% of those shooters are targeting gun-free zones because they're not going to be met with sufficient stopping force. That's basically, you sitting ducks in a place where there's, especially in educational systems, in schools. There's a school district in Ohio that actually, near Cincinnati, that passed legislation where teachers could have a secure, all teachers took training on how to use a firearm, and they were able to securely store a firearm underneath their desk. And there have been 0 threats in that district. Now, there weren't many before, but each teacher is confident. In fact, since the education process began, the people that are sending their schools there, their kids to those schools, the parents, including the faculty that were wishy-washy on it, that weren't sure, they love it now. They feel safer. They actually feel that they have the adequate education and information to stop a shooter before they kill more kids, which we know can happen. I mean, if you have an active shooter in a school and it's a gun-free zone, you have to admit that it's just open season there. If there's someone there with the stopping force of a gun, then that could eliminate.
You know, you say they can eliminate the threat, but how do we? I guess I understand what you're saying. Like, these people can have weapons, they are trained, and they can stop the threat. That should it happen, they can defend themselves and people close to them. But if all our problem is just shooting the threat without some means of, I know everything by active shooter, it's like it's happening in the moment. There's not really much time to debate or discuss or do anything else about except defend, run, hide, protect people, go after them. But I guess the way people may see it is that even if you stop them, you eventually have to deal with a bunch of questions on why were they doing this in the first place, and that brings up the question of how do we deal with this situation to make sure it doesn't happen again. Like, usually Democrats say, look, here's the thing, we can stop all these guns and they won't be able to gain access to them. And Republicans usually go to the point of either if they do that, we don't have means protecting ourselves, and the more extreme, they're trying to take away the guns. So what we need to do is find, I guess, a balance of sorts between it. We need to, you say yourself, like a safe space. So if we can include figures into the safe space where they are trained out respect, like they said, teachers or law enforcement, but those are sort of a different situation. Like law enforcement or military, it's part of their duty to learn how to use these things. There are people like under the law who are certifiably trained and given the responsibility of holding these arms. And if you were to just say, like, okay, like every random citizen out there, you now have permission to take the training, you can now hold a gun, it doesn't like present the right kind of message about the country in general. It basically says that, okay, everyone is under watch for a suspicious person. They're always, it might be dangerous. And yes, in a heat of a moment, there's only a certain amount of time to react before you can do something about it. And if you do have a firearm in this situation, I'm not against you people saying, I'm going to go stop them. I'm going to go defend these people in general. But the problem I have against that is that it sort of gets the notion that anyone and everyone can use these. It doesn't, not that it doesn't make the problem safer, it's that it also at the same time increases the problem by not necessarily, not really dealing with it in general. You deal with this current situation, like an active shooter situation is like a piece of the pie. It's a small moment caused by a lot of other events that in turn is part of a much bigger situation. And when we deal with small moments, it's like winning the battle but still fighting the war itself. We want to stop the gun violence. Both sides want to stop gun violence in general. But what we seem to have a problem figuring out is just how that problem works. And so he says you want the guns, people to be safe. People use guns, they feel safer, they can defend themselves. But it's a game that we have to keep up again and again and again without any real situation. There's no real sense to stop them from access to guns before they create the shooter situation. There's no means of dealing with the problem so that other people can't get access to them. Even if they do, it's you say that stopping the amount of guns people get will not stop the problem, but expanding the amount of guns someone can get also won't stop the problem. There needs to be a middle ground in here, and if I turn this to you first to you and let you know what you think the middle ground between our two.
The middle ground, I think. Sorry if you hear my ESPN notifications come through. The middle ground is, yes, we want to stop gun violence, unnecessary gun violence. I think a very compelling argument is by eliminating gun-free zones, or if you need to have a gun-free zone, whatever organization has a gun-free zone needs to show the ability to secure that gun-free zone with properly trained and security personnel who have passed background checks, who have passed psychiatric evaluations, who can actually monitor that space. There's just too many incidences in gun-free zones, specifically because they are targeted by mass shooters, where they're able to kill more people because someone there doesn't have a gun. So I think you just let citizens exercise their right to keep and bear arms and get the education and the certification required to have a concealed carry firearm so that they can stop. I mean, that's why concealed carry laws exist. They exist to stop threats like mass shooters. That's why they're there. No one I've ever met, in the vast majority, like I said, over 99.9% of people who are concealed carry permit or concealed carriers licensed, they never want to use their gun. They never want to use it. They are trained specifically to use a concealed firearm to eliminate the threat of someone harming someone else. So these people who are trained to concealed carry should be all of our friends, because while we should be focusing on mental health, and I'm fine with background checks, while we're focusing on trying to get guns away from people who shouldn't, we need to have people in place who can stop the inevitable threat and the incidences that occur of mass shootings. But my question to you, and I'm interested on your thoughts on this, kitchen knives are being used in about half of all the stabbings in the UK. Kitchen knives. In fact, it's actually prompted a group of doctors to call for a ban on long pointed kitchen knives. And so my question to you is, at what point do the bans become?
I think the bans become nonsense when you start affiliating them with basically anything possible. I guess it's like how you would see attack on PC language. Like if it's like a certain racial slur or offensive talk, then yes, that's sort of okay. But if we go to even smaller words and smaller terms that some people could mistake as offended, you probably think, okay, that's going too far. And that's sort of where knives and guns differ. Like on one hand, a knife varies. You don't always, it's not like when you use a knife, it's really hard to gain multiple targets at once. You can probably attack out one person too before being down, but guns, they have a wider range, wider ammunition, and more targets that they can affect. So, and especially if you go to other things like heavy assault rifles, that is stacking up against it, against the argument. So the too far point is whether or not the argument for why we should ban these or not makes sense, and whether or not its views on safety affects a certain amount of people. And I know everyone wants to, no one wants to use a gun, no one wants to use violence, no one wants to attack someone. But, and yes, in the case of defending ourselves, we are told that right. But every time these active shooter situations come by, it's always the lines sort of blur together. Some people say we should stop this. Some people say if you do this, you take away our rights. And what we need to understand is we're dealing with something that's a lot broader than this. It's a broader concept. If we remove, say, situations, you say you can use the guns here, but what about the people who don't want this? To people who think that they will be safe if we can limit who gets a gun, who can hold on to this. Like some people prefer that others who they trust more to handle a firearm, which does go back to military experience or police training. These people for the most part, are trusted by the public to handle weapons. And even then, we have these things where stereotypes and things involving race go back to people getting shot for no reason. And that even then, you're questioning people who are qualified to use a firearm. So in the case of an active shooter situation, you want them to be protected, but at the same time, you worry that at one point we would go too far in how much we can defend ourselves. It's like if you thought someone was making a move and then opened fire on them, and then it turns out they weren't really a threat, where's the blame lie? You were the one who used the gun that time, not them. So by that logic, you could be charged. So in that case, we need to figure out how much. It comes down to who should be trained to use these weapons. Who can we trust? And at the time, the idea of regular citizens, especially in this day and age, being handled, given the rights to use firearms whenever and wherever, even if they don't want to use them, is an unnerving situation because it doesn't really say we are a safe country. It says we are a country preparing for the inevitable. Why should we prepare for the inevitable when we can try to stop the inevitable before it happens? That way, we can make sure people are safe. We can keep necessity requirements in case it happens. But we should deal with an active shooter situation. We should deal with the elements before the active shooting takes place in order to deal with the problem. That's just my view of it. I feel like we focus so much on what to do in the problem, and that part can be given. As you point out, we can look at it from that perspective. But if we all deal with everything in the now, we never really deal with the source of that problem. How do we stop shootings from happening in the first place?
You're right, in the sense that we want to stop shooters in the first place. And that's a good conversation to have. But this isn't the place for that. Just simply because we're talking about how guns can actually stop violence instead of causing violence. We got to look at guns differently. The guns are here to stay. They're not going anywhere. America was founded on the principle of freedom, freedom to defend yourself. It was also founded on freedom from tyranny. This is why guns are such a big part of our culture. This is permeated from the 18th century to now, and they will never leave. We'll never get rid of guns as long as the Bill of Rights stands on 2 feet. But we can look at the facts. My favorite is in Kennesaw, Georgia, and this is in 1982. There was a law passed requiring heads of household to keep at least one firearm in the house. And I love this study. In the burglary rate dropped 89% in Kennesaw, Georgia. 89% when head of households were required to keep a gun in their home. We see the same statistics in Switzerland, where gun ownership is required. Everyone is trained, and every household has a gun. And by the way, today, and that was in 1982, today, the violent crime rate in Kennesaw is still 85% lower than Georgia's state average, and also about the same percentage lower than the national average. And so this is proof that the presence of firearms, just the knowledge that firearms could be somewhere, can drop violent crime. If burglaries are violent, they're breaking into property. I mean, they're willing to hurt people to take property. Burglaries dropped 89% there. So just the knowledge of knowing that someone there has a gun had a massive impact on the way that criminals behaved. It will be, I'm just going to go ahead and use my time and close. Criminals behave differently when they know that there's a threat. We've seen it in Georgia. We've seen it in the 9 countries in Europe that have freer laws for defense than the other 9 that have stricter gun control laws. We've seen that in the UK, that the lack of guns does not equate to a lack of violence. In fact, by far, it was 2,000 per 100,000 people involved in a violent incident, whereas in America was 488. per 100,000. That's a substantial difference. The Second Amendment of the Constitution protects our right to keep and bear arms. If we have the gun-free zones eliminated and just have smart, licensed people who are trained to use their guns only in the right situations, we can avoid that 92% of active shooter situations that target gun-free zones, and our universities, our elementary schools, our government buildings, and our citizens and our friends and family neighbors and our neighbors and our family members can be safe. Get rid of gun-free zones.
All right, so you said that Constitution was founded to allow us protection from tyranny and right to bear arms. But you seem to forget that as time goes on, rules change, laws adapt, the world around us shifts its place, and even guns themselves have grown in terms of strength and fortitude and power. Like, I'm pretty sure when they had it in mind, no one thought that someone could commit a terrorist act with those really long muskets and to reload in about a minute or so. And you say that by people knowing that the guns exist, they will be too afraid to use it. And I can see what you're going with, but you can expand that idea that because the weapon exists, they will be afraid to use it. And you still seem to forget that this does not mean that the problem is solved. The weapons are still out there, and even if they exist, the fact that we shouldn't be able to, how much we use them is a problem. Because I know this one could seem a bit extreme on how I see things, but one of these things that history class I was learned about the Cold War was that the ethnic principles of how people saw developing nuclear arms, and that yes, we were developing a whole bunch of weapons with the power to blow up, seriously cause World War III. But at the same time, it was that exact fear of these weapons that prevented both sides of the Cold War from basically entering a state of total nuclear destruction. They were afraid to go to war against one another because they knew it would result in their demise. But in quote war games, the only winning move is not to play, in that sense that you might have the guns, you might use them to scare the other side into not firing them, but they still exist and they can still be used. Even if you have guns, the problem is still out there. It's not changing at any point. So unless we find a way to limit who gets the gun and just create the idea that if you remove a safe space and people can use them, that's not going to solve the entire problem itself. It's just going to delay the problem again and again and again, and never-ending cycle of people getting hurt, people firing back, both sides debating on what can be done to stop them, and nothing will ever get resolved because we still don't have a solution in that sense. You say that by removing the safe spaces, we can protect ourselves. And in that case, how much do we have to look over our own backs every second to worry that someone could be there with a gun? If we limit who can use them, then we can protect ourselves, and we can make it so that people can have the right to use them if they're well trained. But when that happens, there's no real solution in the end. You're just saying, I have a gun, you have a gun, we're at an impasse. And I don't see that as a long-term solution. It's more like a delaying of the inevitable. So I guess I do see your point. I see that you think, well, these show that by holding on to the firearms, this crime rates have gone down, and people do not want to get involved because they know there's a chance that the other side can fight back. But holding on to that type of logic, we don't deal with the problem. We just hold it off. We say we found a solution, but in reality, we've created a form of stalemate. We've held them in place for as long as they can. And yes, it solves a problem, but at the same time, it doesn't, because it just holds you to a spot of essentially total destruction, that a gun can be used to protect people, but it can also be used to kill people. Same as a knife, but it's how it's used that's the problem. And we need to determine who can trusted to use it for the right reasons, who can be trusted to use it for the wrong reasons. But the way I see it, building safe spaces will not fix that. It will just be another delayed excuse to just delay the inevitable.